Hey folks, I think we're a couple minutes past 6. We are going to get going. Welcome to, let the folks go sit down. Welcome to Science Cafe. This is getting close to our 100th that we've done. So let me ask first of all, how many of you have never been to a Science Cafe before? Excellent, excellent, excellent. That means the regulars have to hear my spiel again. So my name is David Brooks. I write for the Concord Monitor, write the Granite Geek column and blog and podcast and all that stuff we do these days. And I have been moderating Science Cafes for 8.5 years since they started. They were started by a couple of science fans, Dan Marchek, who was a computer guy down in Brookline, and Sarah Eck, who got a PhD in sort of the biomedical field out near Dartmouth. And both of them basically, they knew about Science Cafes in Europe, which is this program that's been going on for a long time. And thought it'd be cool to start in New Hampshire. They sort of ran into each other and started one and invited me to come along. At the time I worked for the Nashville Telegraph, and I thought it was a great idea. It'd be awesome, just the sort of thing my wife and I want to do in the evening, right? Something better, more fun than trivia night at the bar. And I thought it would last like 6 months and fizzle out. And we started it up here in Concord, went down to Nashville where I was. When 4 years ago I joined the Concord Monitor, I came up here. They're still running a separate one down in Nashville, so there's 2 of them going now, 2 every month. And as I say, it's about 8.5 years now. We're getting close to 100. Basically, we choose a topic, invite wise, educated people who are willing to work for free, come and talk to you. Working for food, that's true. It's not quite free. And get the audience to ask questions. It's all driven by your questions. We don't have there's no presentation or anything like that. ConcordTV is filming it, and it will be shown on Concord TV, and it's online, shared with other cable access television channels around the country. The Concord TV folks tell me this is pretty popular with other channels. It's pretty high quality content. And the joke I have, but it's not really a joke, is that for some reason we're very popular in Salt Lake City. So if you ever go to Utah, maybe people will recognize you on the street.
Street autograph.
Let's see. My usual spiel is tip your wait staff well, because this is kind of a pain in the neck actually for them, all of us coming at once and leaving at once. Next month we are having that topic. It's actually going to be on a different day. Usually we're the 4th Wednesday, but the 4th Wednesday would be right before Thanksgiving. So we're doing it on the 3rd Wednesday, November 20th next month. And the subject is going to be engineered lumber or mass timber, which is a whole new product that's being made out of lumber used to building. And in fact, the building code, the National Building Code, was just updated, allowing it to be used for building up to 18-story tall. And there is a big push to build with lumber as compared to steel and concrete for a variety of reasons. One is that, give our loggers an income and use the timber. Another one is that it takes the carbon that's been absorbed by the trees and basically locks it away in a building instead of all the carbon that is produced by making steel and concrete. So there's quite a large push. In fact, I just went to a conference about it last week. So we're going to be talking about that, kind of the construction material of the future. Lumber isn't exactly futuristic. So that'll be next month. We do not have one in December. The Nashua topic next month, which is the second Tuesday, is going to be about residential solar. So if you've thought about putting solar on your house, which by the way I just did, and if you'd like I can show you the app, see how much I produced today. It's really exciting. So you can go down and talk to them in Nashua. I think that's about it. So I am going to come around. When you have questions, raise your hand, just like in school, and I will come around with a microphone. Wait for the mic so that the TV folks can hear you. And let me get to you. And I think that's all it. So, all right, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask our 3 panelists to introduce themselves, to tell you why you should pay any attention to them. And when they are done, I will ask the first question, and after that, it's up to you. If you don't ask anything, it'll be really dull. So don't do that. Okay, so who are you, and why should we listen to you?
Hi, my name is Rachel Steindl-Burdine. I'm an assistant professor.
A little bit closer.
Assistant professor at UNH. I'm a socio-phonetician, so the two bits of that, so the first part is socio for sociolinguistics. So I look at how language varies. I'm interested in language and identity, so I do a lot of work on Jewish languages. And the phonetician part means I look at the sounds of language, so I do some work on vowels, but I'm really interested in tone and intonation, so sort of the melody of speech and sort of the rhythm of speech.
Hi, my name is Tim Polya. I teach linguistics at Dartmouth. I especially work on historical linguistics, which means the way languages change over time and diversify in their sound systems, grammar, vocabulary, all of that sort of thing. And you should pay attention to me. I must know what I'm talking about because I obviously didn't get the job at Dartmouth based on my books.
That was my colleague Tim Polya. It's a tough act to follow. I'm Laura McPherson. I'm an assistant professor of linguistics at Dartmouth College as well. I am a field worker, so I work on endangered languages and unwritten languages, primarily in West Africa, and also a phonologist. So I am interested in sounds, how they pattern, and in particular also on tone, but the kind of tone and pitch that changes the meaning of words entirely, or plays a role in grammar, which African languages are full of.
All right, well, can I just say, all the science cafes have done, the three of you did your introductions more quickly than anybody else. Usually I have to like go in and grab the microphone right from people, so it's very impressive. So I'm gonna start off asking you a question. So, and I am gonna ask you sort of the most basic question I can think of, which is where do languages, or where does language come from? I've heard, I mean, is this just like, you know, animal grunts that we've turned into words, or is it handed down from on high, or what?
So there was actually a ban on discussion of this question in, I think it was the French Linguistic Academy, sort of when they were first getting started. They were tired of having people debate about this, and they sort of threw up their hands and said, well, we don't know, and we can't tell, so no talking about this. Since then, I mean, there's a few different things we can look at. We can look at sort of when our anatomy developed in order to produce the speech sounds we can make. So stuff like the hyoid bone, which controls sort of your larynx and helps control your larynx. We can see a million years ago we start getting something, maybe something, so we start getting sort of the structures in place, but obviously sign languages exist too. And yeah, there really are sort of a lot of debates. Some people think it sort of comes from music, but again, people argue about that. I know Noam Chomsky wrote a paper with some other linguists, so Hauser was also on that one, and Finch, basically saying we got the ability to do recursion, so sort of embedding things in other things and starting to do things like count, and sort of as an offshoot of that, we sort of got language as a bonus, but we really kind of don't know. I don't know if either of you have your thoughts.
Yeah, so there's no longer a ban on talking about this or even more writing about this. So there are huge numbers of books and there are conferences every year, and there's no agreement, right? Otherwise, they just go to the conference and say, okay, let's have lunch. There's one big issue is what is language for, right? And some people say, well, it's primarily for thought. It helps you, and then as a side benefit of that, you can have communication. Others say it's primarily for communication. There's one guy who says it's primarily for maintaining social harmony, because unlike chimpanzees, humans don't actually groom each other, at least not in my family, pulling the bugs and mice out of the hair on each other's back, which is a way for chimpanzees to maintain social groupings, so that a lot of what we do with language is talk, hey, how are you, how's the kids, etc., and that you maintain social relations. So if that's, so it's sort of, the question is partly, what did language first develop for primarily? Obviously, we can use it for all sorts of things now, like having science cafes, which was not probably the original function of language, but that then affects where you think it comes from. I'm more in the language developed primarily for communication point of view, and then that allows, among other things, we get thought from it, or not thought, I mean, we had thought before, but it helps to structure our thought in particular ways. And then, yeah, the anatomy things, if it's for communication, then the anatomy of the vocal tract becomes very important. And there's fierce debate among specialists, which I'm not, about whether Neanderthals had the right sort of vocal tract to make vowels like E and U, and various other things, or whether they could only, like all of you and us when we were 6 months old or 3 months old, we couldn't say E or U. Think of a baby, they say ah, ah. When they're crying, they don't say ee, or ooh. Because on the other hand, like dogs, they don't choke on our food. Be careful eating tonight, because the way their vocal tract is structured. But as you get older, your vocal tract changes. You can speak better, but you can also choke to death on food. So it must be some sort of adaptively beneficial thing to be able to make those speech sounds, because otherwise there would be no reason for it to have happened, and people would just say E or ah all the time.
You got it covered.
Okay. All right, folks, it's up to you. It's always slow. The first couple of questions are tough. Come on, somebody. All right, we got one back. By the way, so when I hand the microphone to you, hold it closer to your mouth than you think you should.
Am I the only one that is upset nowadays when I hear a younger person say mountain or fountain or curtain? Is this how people talk now?
This is sociophonetics.
So I'll sort of go meta on this to start. I'll go meta on this to start. So people complain about how young people talk sort of all the time. So I just know in my lifetime there's been complaints about people using uptalk, so when your voice goes up at the end. There's complaints about vocal fry, right, where you sort of drop the pitch really low. Complaints about kids texting. So part of this is that language change, as the other panelists, language changes all the time. So young people just sort of often talk differently than older people. But what's going on with mountain specifically? Should I try to explain phonemes? So yeah. So what's going on is phonologists, so people who look at the sound patterns of language, what's going on is that you sort of have a sound in your head. So you have an idea of, for example, what a T sound sounds like. But what actually comes out of your mouth will sort of change depending on its position in the word and sort of the other sounds around it. So we can do a little experiment right now. I encourage you to do this, even if it feels silly. So put your hand really close to your mouth and say the word tap. 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 So when you do that, you should feel a little puff of air coming out after that T. So that's called aspiration. It's sort of, again, just this little puff of air. But if you say a word like pat, so again, put your hand up, you don't get that little puff of air. So basically the T sound changes if it's at the beginning of the word or at the end, and then also if it's after a sound like N. So mountain, right, mountain. Often you either have what's called an unreleased T, where your T just sort of goes up and stays there, or what's going on with mountain is you get a glottal stop. So the glottis is the space between your vocal folds and your larynx and your Adam's apple. So what happens is the vocal folds sort of close, and you get that X sound, mountain. So that's just sort of a variation that we can see, right? You say mountain with sort of the T just going up, or do you say mountain with the glottal stop? We can also see this glottal stop in some varieties of British English. So if you have a word like butter, so we make this little thing called a tap butter in American English, but in some varieties of British English, they put a glottal stop in there, butter. So you can say, yeah, sound like a Cockney, right? Butter, and you get that glottal stop in there. So yeah, it's basically language change. People sort of have different rules in their head about, well, what do I do after an N, right? Do I do mountain, or do I do mountain? And stuff just sort of varies.
I'll just add a couple little notes. One is we're all familiar with a group of 4 young mop-headed fellows from Liverpool who called themselves the Beatles. instead of the Beatles. So they did that same thing with the Gauls stuff. Also, this mountain thing, do you know if Jim, our colleague, Jim Stanford, so I should plug his book right now. He just, right now, his book on New England English is coming out, and I think he may have something in there about the pronunciation of mountain, because it's actually variable in different regions, that people will pronounce it differently. But you're right, it's also variable by age or by all sorts of things, and that's what sociolinguistic looks at, all sorts of variation in language.
Who wrote that?
James Stanford, like the university, but he is not. Stanford University is a much better place.
All right, another question. Let me go over there and knock my feet.
Going forward, do you see the study of linguistics becoming more interesting to younger people?
Absolutely. We've already seen, even in the last, decade, 2 decades, a major increase in interest among undergraduates. I mean, before, unfortunately, linguistics is something that's not taught in high schools. I mean, I think all of us up here wishes that it were part of the high school curriculum. But it's not, so university is usually the first place people could get exposed to the study or even heard of linguistics. So before, students would come in and have really no idea what linguistics is, and we're starting to see now high schoolers coming to college already knowing they want to study linguistics. There are linguistic Olympiads out there for high school students, and there's sort of more popular books out there, John McWhorter and Steven Pinker and some of these other sort of popular linguistics writers, and students are reading this and they realize, oh wait, this is actually really cool, and it makes you think about the stuff that's coming out of your mouth in a way that you never did before. So I think we're seeing a lot of interest in students. I don't know if it's that our field is getting more interesting or if it's just that students have realized it's interesting. I'd like to think that our field continues to get interesting, but it may just be an exposure thing.
I'll also add that there's getting to be more job opportunities for linguistics, linguists, especially computational linguistics, computational anything, but as people are designing computers that need to interact with humans using natural language more and more, then obviously in the old days computers were lousy at it, and they're getting better. So we have former students who are working for Alexa, I guess working on Alexa. Maybe eventually we'll all be working for Alexa, but right now. Or other computational linguistics projects like that. So that's a field where students think they're not only interested in linguistics, but say I can get a job, a high-paying job afterwards doing something related to language and computers.
Okay. I'll come back here and then I'll come over.
I've got about 6 questions.
No, just
I'll
one,
stick
just
with
one.
One of the things that's always fascinated me is the regionality of English within the United States. And you talk about the R, well, that's very common. You hear that in Chicago usually. A lot of our witscasters come from there because theoretically you can understand me better. I'm not sure you can. When my kids were very little, and I'm talking like 6 weeks old, 7 weeks old, we taught them to sign. And the reason we did that was they didn't have the vocal capability, but they had the ability to understand what they wanted to say or ask for or whatever. So basically it was about 20, 25 words that they learned, and then it went away as soon as they could speak. Sometimes not so well, but anyway. How do you see the effect of other languages impacting us? Spanish, the trilling, German, the plural, French. I mean, we're becoming a global communications market. How do you see that affecting linguistics?
Apparently it's up to me, I'm holding the microphone. So languages always affect each other if there are speakers, particularly speakers who become even to a little degree bilingual. So English, I think most people know, is full of words that are borrowed from French and borrowed from Latin that come from the past several hundred years. And sometimes we have like a native English word, manly, and then we have another word that means the same thing, masculine, which is borrowed from another language. And if you get enough speakers of another language, say French, who become bilingual in English in the medieval period, you even borrow words that are very basic, like very, which is a French word in origin. And you can even bring in new sounds. V was never used at the beginnings of words in Old English. It's only in the Middle English period, say about 700 years ago, that you start getting V's in native words. So yeah, we could certainly get that influence from other languages, speakers, if there are enough of them, and if their kids are influenced enough by their parents' speech. But as everyone knows, kids are not always as influenced by their parents as parents would like. Kids often want to talk like the other people around them, or particularly like the other kids around them, like the kids who are 3 or 4 years older. Now, I have a Minnesota accent, not because I grew up in Minnesota, I was born there, but because my 6 older brothers and sisters had Minnesota accents. So even though I grew up in Virginia, I still say, oh yeah. But there weren't enough of us in Northern Virginia to affect the Northern Virginia dialect. There were 8 of us, but still not quite enough. So yeah, if you get in parts of the southwestern US with lots of Spanish-speaking people moving in, then that can certainly impact the way that English develops there, although you often find by the 3rd generation or even the 2nd generation that the kids don't speak Spanish or they don't want to speak Spanish because they want to be more American. But there still would be some influence, and it can even, it can change not just the vocabulary, but sometimes even the grammar of the language, the sound system of the language. As to the specific things that are going on, I mostly work on the older dead varieties of English, so maybe I'll pass this to sociolinguists.
Yeah, we'll add to that. So sometimes we're seeing the emergence now of what are called world Englishes or indigenized varieties of English. So Indian English is one example. So we see this in a lot of former British colonies. So Indian English, which has borrowed some of what are called retroflex sounds. So if you put your tongue back when you make ta ta ta, when you make that sound, that's a retroflex T. It's very common in South Asian languages. So we actually see that, for example, in Indian English. Singapore English has tone, so lexical tone, like what Laura works on, just because Cantonese, Chinese languages, or not Cantonese in Singapore, but Cantonese, yeah, has lexical tone, so that sort of made its way into Singapore English. There are also these particles like la. It's sort of this all-purpose particle that shows up in Singapore English, again, from the local languages there. And yeah, sometimes we see those effects from immigrant communities. So I can give one example, again, working on Jewish languages. Yiddish has an ability to move stuff to the front of sentences. So in some varieties of English around New York City, you can say something like pizza you want, right? Which again reflects the structure that you can do in Yiddish, or constructions like you want that I should do that, right? Again, is sort of a direct borrowing from Yiddish.
Why after that? You want that I should do that? Why?
Yeah. So we do see, again, it's sort of, like you said, there needs to be kind of enough speakers to sort of get that going. 1 or 2 speakers is enough, but if you have sort of an entire immigrant community sort of interacting with each other, you can get those things emerging.
So I never realized that Yoda was Yiddish, but apparently so. Okay, you had a question?
I'm just curious about in the environment and place in language, and just because I just got back from North Carolina and was just so struck by how long it takes for words to come out. And well, just from a northerner standpoint, the rhythm and everything in that language, the dialect is just so different, and I'm just curious, is it, part of me, I kept thinking, well, maybe it's because it was really hot when I was down there. I was like, oh yeah, because everything slows down, you know? And I'm just curious if there are studies on that kind of thing, like place and
Diction and dialects, that's you.
So I know people have looked at differences in speech rate, and your impression is correct. So people in the South, in the United States, do generally have a slower speech rate than people in the north. I'm kind of skeptical about sort of environmental stuff affecting that directly. Again, part of this is I'm a sociolinguist, so I want everything to come to sort of social meaning and sort of social construction. So I think it's just, again, it's one way that you can see variation from place to place, and you can see these differences from language to language. Yeah, so it's just sort of one way that language can vary. Talk about the environments.
Yeah, I'll add just one thought about the environment, which is there's been kind of an increase in studies, not often from linguists, more often from economists or other people who just start working in language, showing correlations between environmental factors and language. So, for instance, languages spoken at higher elevations are more likely to have tone. The use of pitch, to change meaning, and the, explanation is, because the air is more rarefied or something, perhaps the pitch travels. Most linguists don't think these are true. These studies are true. When you look at a lot of these, when you look at a large data set, you can find these spurious correlations between anything. I mean, you can find a correlation between linguistic diversity and the number of car accidents in a place. Yes, no, the higher the linguistic diversity, the more car accidents. Yes. But I mean, spurious, right? I mean, just all sorts of crazy things that people don't believe to be true. And so I think the danger is finding something that feels plausible, because it feels certainly plausible that, it's hot, so people are just kind of like, I don't need to talk as quickly, I'm tired. Yeah, they did actually find the correlation between languages that have higher, what's known as morphological complexity, so sort of more little bits of meaning that get crushed into verbs, for instance, and the number of siestas that are taken, and it's tiring speaking those languages with lots of morphological complexity, but a lot of people don't think it's true. There doesn't seem to be a huge effect of direct environmental factors on, grammatical things like that.
Actually, I can see the car accident thing. If you got a complicated language, you're yelling at people, it's a lot of thought, you run into the stop sign.
Exactly, you can't understand the other guy in the car.
Yeah.
So, as linguists, some of you deal with not just the auditory oral tradition, but also written forms of language, right? Well, as you were talking about teaching your kids sign language, I got thinking about texting. And texting is a written substitute for communication, immediate communication, casual immediate communication. Thinking that a lot of it now is peppered so much with exclamation points, emojis, GIFs, all kinds of things, and there's fewer words and more, sometimes it's animation, and it seems almost as if our written language is shifting more towards sign language, or toward things that provide more subtle nuances of emotion and meaning, or contradictory meaning. Do anybody who's doing work in that area, how the visual influence and the visual graphic opportunities are influencing our speech?
So there's a really great book that just came out this summer, was it? Yeah, very recently by Gretchen McCullough. It's called Because Internet. And it's all about sort of language in the internet age. And she talks a lot about this, about sort of the evolution of the written language on the internet or in texting or whatever. It's fascinating, really accessible, great book. So the thing is that most of the written records that we have were things that were written either formally or they were, tax documents or stuff. It wasn't, just kind of writing casually back and forth, unless it was in long letters and everything. But now with your phone and with the internet and with everything else, you can just, send off a quick little message really quickly and just speak casually like you would to a friend. I mean, I think if you recorded yourselves talking to friends and tried to transcribe it, you would find you don't talk anything like what you write. That's what we're seeing now with texting, is that it's language like people speak it. But the problem is that it's hard to get things like sarcasm or emotion or a subtle tone of voice across in writing, right? And in the written word, it just isn't there because you don't have things like pitch or speech rate or other things. And so emojis are being brought in really clever ways by internet users to indicate things like that. And punctuation is huge. I mean, anybody of my generation and below will know, you don't want to get a text that says okay with one period after it. You're like, whoa, I'm in trouble, right? You know, a single period it means like it's serious, right? Exclamation mark is fine. A couple means you're really enthusiastic. No punctuation is fine, but punctuation is taking on this new life to represent all this stuff that we couldn't really get through in the written word before. And GIFs and emojis are doing the same thing. You want to add?
So actually, that is a fabulous book. I read it preparing for this. And one of the things she talks about is she compares the punctuation in texting to the punctuation of postcards, because that was the one other previous form of sort of casual writing. And I'm on my town's history committee, and one of the things we have is lots of postcards that were written from local hotels, and it's really interesting to see that it's absolutely correct. And she talks about that very punctuation thing, the dot, dot, dot. In fact, and she has lots of postcards that were written by the Beatles, speaking of who you mentioned earlier, and actually all these Beatles postcards written to their friends that were collected, and they use the same kind of weird punctuation that now we think of as being, you know, those kids in texting. So anyway, great book. All right, was there somebody else that had a question? I think over there, and then I'll come back here. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Going
Lighter
in the
shoes.
opposite direction, I'm interested in lost or suppressed languages, particularly Native American languages, where language is so tied to culture, and even if, you know, a lot of the people are gone, but the whole culture is suppressed. How do you bring it back? And if you bring back a lost language, can you ever bring it back to what it originally was?
That's a really good question, and it's a really important issue. It's the International Year of Indigenous Languages. You know, over half of the world's languages are endangered right now of extinction. I mean, we're talking about like 3,500 languages, and the United States and North America has suffered incredibly in a loss of linguistic diversity. And so it's really hard to bring a language back. It's been done. Modern Hebrew is one case, and if you've worked on Jewish language, I'll pass this to you afterwards, and maybe you can talk about that case, because that's sort of held up as the one case where we really have managed to bring a dead language back and turn it into the first tongue of children and new speakers. There have been some other cases. I think Miamia is an indigenous language that's been brought back. Wampanoag in sort of. But once they're gone, it's very, very difficult. You know, what we need to do is document the languages. The more you have recordings of everyday speech, recordings of different genres, recordings of people arguing. I mean, because the thing is that a lot of endangered languages, the only records we have are maybe a word list by some explorer 400 years ago, or like sometimes you'll have like a translation of the Bible, and like all of this is really useful for bringing languages back. But it doesn't tell you how to, you know, yell at your neighbor, or how to, you know, flirt, or how to joke, you know. So all of these really integral parts of a language are just usually not documented, and so when it comes back, it's going to be different.
Yeah, to add to that about specifically the case of modern Hebrew, which is sort of again held up as it was lost and then it came back. Well, first off, it wasn't really lost to a certain extent, right? So Hebrew is a liturgical language of the Jewish people, and it was in sort of Yiddish-speaking areas and Arabic-speaking areas of the Mizrahi Jews in the Middle East and the Jews in Eastern Europe. There was still knowledge of the language from, again, reading prayer books and things like that. But one thing that gets lost is you sort of have a basic idea of how to pronounce things, but stuff like what I look at, so the intonation and the prosody, that doesn't get written down in text, which is, again, what's going on with some of the emojis, right, trying to get that. So when modern Hebrew was revived, right, so number one, you had to figure out how exactly to pronounce it and sort of the intonation, so a lot of that probably actually came from Yiddish, which was the first language of a lot of the speakers. You had to do things like swear and yell at your neighbors, so let's just borrow some stuff from Arabic, right, and use that because it's a related language. And there are some linguists who go around calling it Israeli to sort of claim like it's not modern Hebrew. This is actually a completely separate thing from the biblical Hebrew. So again, I'm going to call it modern Israeli instead. So yeah, even that one exception we have is sort of contested. So yeah, once it's gone, so all the more reason to keep things alive.
Yeah, I'll just add, bringing back a dead language is really hard, but even keeping alive a language that seems to be dying and restoring it to full health is extremely difficult, although there are a lot of people trying to do that, particularly with Native American languages. It's a very big thing. And there are some successes. Hawaiian is better off than it was with a really intensive effort to bring Hawaiian back. And the very few people, percentage-wise, in Hawaii speak Hawaiian or even are ethnically Hawaiian, a minority are ethnically Hawaiian, but they have schools and a whole program where people are developing some fluency now, young people. And in New Zealand, they're trying to do the same thing with Maori with some success. But then there are places like Ireland where there are maybe 10 to 20,000 people who still really speak Irish dialect fluently, natively. And the Republic of Ireland has spent the past 100 years trying to get people to speak Irish. The problem is that they end up speaking Irish because they learn it in school about the way that most Americans speak Spanish. They take it, they pass their classes, and then they can't really speak it fluently. They speak it well enough to pass the test to get a government job, whereas people who really speak Irishly fluently and natively end up then not getting government jobs because the reason they speak Irish is they're in the poorest parts of Western Ireland where the farms are even more rocky than New Hampshire farms, and they want their children to learn English so they can move to Boston. And their children do learn English. Everyone in Ireland speaks English now, so it's really hard to get those people to buy into speaking Irish. And so that's even in a country where the whole ethos of the country has been, we need to revitalize language. But it's not impossible. People are working on it, and there are some success stories. And particularly for Native American peoples, you're exactly right. It's a very important part of their culture and helpful to revitalize their culture and to improve their economic and social conditions also.
All right.
Hi there. I was having a conversation just today with some people about that curious thing that went around the internet about a year ago where the same exact recorded word was heard completely differently by different people, and they couldn't understand each other. And someone said one of the interpretations is Laurel, and Yanni, that's it. How would that type of thing, like obviously it's something with the frequency you're dominant or you're hearing, how would that affect how you speak? If you're hearing things differently, that could alter your speech, I assume.
That's a really good question. That was a fun one. It was like, is the dress, gold and white, or is it blue and black, a lot of sounds that we as native speakers of English, are completely distinct to us. We would never confuse them under normal circumstances, are actually acoustically very, very similar to one another. So L and R, for instance, la, ra, are actually fairly similar, which is why some languages which don't have that distinction have a really hard time distinguishing those. And so I think, correct me if I'm wrong, because do you remember the Laurel Yanni thing? Okay, yeah. You might remember better than I do. So, I think it's partially has to do probably with how it was recorded. That some of the frequencies in it were ambiguous between being frequencies associated with like Laurel, the R of the R, and Yanni. I mean, they sound like they should be so different, but do you remember it better than I do? Okay, perfect.
You take it. Figure it out. Yeah, so it is basically, it boils down to stuff being acoustically ambiguous. So when you make a vowel sound like an E versus an oo, what's going on is that what are called the resonance frequencies differ. So it's sort of the same way that a French horn sounds different from a trumpet, sounds different from a clarinet. Sort of how things are vibrating gets different, and sort of those patterns are what helps your mind distinguish between, say, an A and an E, or for Yanni and Laurel, between a ya and a wa. And basically, sort of the simplified version is your brain is sort of picking out either the higher frequencies in the resonances or the lower frequencies in the resonance. and that seems to push you in terms of which way you interpret it. And I know I have a colleague, Rory Turnbull, who's at University of Hawaii, who suggested some people are just sort of more inclined to kind of listen, take the high frequency information as being more important, and some people take the low frequency, and that might correlate with if you're more inclined to hear Yanny or more inclined to hear Laurel. And you can actually do something called a low pass or a high pass filter to sort of pick out the higher frequencies or the low frequencies, and if you do that, again, that'll sort of tilt you to hearing Yanny or Laurel.
Do you think that's genetic, or is it something that can actually be altered by environment?
Do you mind if I?
Yeah, go ahead, if you want to add to that explanation.
So I wanted to actually, if you don't mind, like quickly return to your other original question, which was like, how does that influence then, like when we're talking to each other, you know? I think the thing about it is that because that was something that was snipped out in isolation without anything else around it, and plus they're like I mean, what is Yanny? Like, I mean, does that even mean anything, right? But I mean, the Laurel means something, but because it wasn't embedded in a larger context, you didn't have any sort of benchmarks for who this person is, what their vowels sound like, you know, what their sounds sound like. And that's just not going to be the case when you're speaking to somebody in person. You're going to have a pretty good idea of what somebody's going to say in a lot of cases. And from very little information, your brain will actually figure out it will do the calculations without you knowing it about like how long your vocal tract is, and so where those resonances are going to be for a man and a woman or this particular person, what that person's E is going to sound like versus a child's E, because the frequencies are going to be different person by person. So it's never going to really be a huge problem. Like that particular level of insane ambiguity is not going to be a problem in everyday speech. Yeah.
I would make a comment for those of us who are losing the high end of our hearing as we get older is ambiguity does definitely increase, as my wife would tell you.
Yeah, but it's funny. What you think you're right.
I'm not sure that this is a fair question to any particular linguist. It just happens that the linguists I've known over the last few decades have been selected because they were interested in the kind of language documentation software that I was working on. And so what I'm wondering is when I think about the primary documentation software that are used for endangered languages, that I've certainly had a lot to do with, the Sil International's Fieldworks Language Explorer, and the Max Planck Institute's ELAN. Well, ELAN would be great or is great for annotating YouTube videos, and Flex is great for complex structures by one speaker at a time, but really awkward if you have a group talking. Then I was reading the Macaulay Because Internet and thinking about the changes in morphology and wondering what on earth happens to your documentation software as the units of the language change so that you have LOL, etc. And it's not clear that those should simply be treated as words with roots the way that I've always had to treat words, whether I had any idea of what was meant by words in the language that was being presented, which I usually didn't.
That's a great question. I mean, Elon and Flex are, sort of my bread and butter as a documentary linguist. So Flex, for instance, is a great tool. You can, type in a bunch of stuff in a language, and it'll split it up word by word. You can start identifying the smaller pieces in that word, like prefixes and suffixes. So if you had a word like reopened, it will pick out that re means again, and open is the root, and duh is the past tense, and then you can do whole texts and it'll analyze it, and so if you're working on some language that you don't know particularly well, it can be a really, really powerful tool. So the question is sort of, okay, well, if you've got something like LOL, if you've got, okay, I've got like two answers to this question. The first one is that I think for the most part, people would be using Flex for spoken and not written language. So the question, and so something like LOL, which people do say out loud, or LOL, I guess is what kids these days say. I mean, when I was growing up with the internet, it was LOL, but now I think it's LOL. It's probably not likely to, you're not likely to be using Flex for something that's written like text speak. But if you were, because people are saying things like LOL and stuff now, yeah, it lacks a root in the way, in the classical sense, right? It's an acronym, but people aren't really using it as an acronym anymore. Now it's just kind of a word. So one possibility would be just treat it as a word that means something like, I found that funny, or sarcasm, or all of the various uses that LOL means now. The other possibility is you just have to kind of treat it like an idiom. I mean, things like Flex are a nightmare when you run across something like, let the cat out of the bag, and so, it's glossing it, it's like, I allowed the feline to exit the sack, and you're like, oh, but it means so much more than that, and the whole chunk means this thing, right? And so I think that things like LOL would kind of need to be treated in an idiomatic sense. It's like the whole chunk means this thing. And unfortunately, our softwares are not particularly, that's a place where Flex runs into trouble. When things kind of span across multiple words. Do you guys have anything you want to add about that?
Tell us what Flex is.
Yeah, so it's this software that I was saying where you can type things in and it'll split it up word by word and then analyze it into pieces. And it's great because at the same time it also compiles a dictionary out of it, so it'll find every word and throw it into a dictionary. It's a really, really great tool. Yeah.
Okay, and I gotta say, so people say lol now?
Yeah, kids these days say lol.
Kids these days.
Oh yeah, you can use it for it. I lol. Yeah.
Well, they conjugated there?
So see, it does have a root now. Lol is the root.
I have a question about how broad linguistics really are, because with the deaf community, and how they're really fighting against the medical establishment with cochlear implants because they feel their language is so much more expressive than our spoken language. And so many children are being encouraged, or families being encouraged to do this, and the parents we can't really talk to their kids. Is there any information or studies into how they're dealing with sign language or that, crossing the bridge?
So there are a number of deaf linguists who work on ASL. Gallaudet University has a number of linguists there. Again, I think an important thing to remember, these people aren't aware, sign languages are full languages of their own right. So ASL is not just sort of there's something called manual assigned English, yeah, which is literally taking English word for word and signing each individual word. ASL has a completely different grammar, a completely different structure, sort of a lot of interesting things that can be done there. And you're right in that there is some tension within sort of different people who have hearing loss, and there's sort of a difference between deaf with a lowercase d and deaf with an uppercase d. And I think it sort of relates to where deaf is with the uppercase d is sort of the culture. And it does, you see a lot of the same rhetoric that you see with endangered languages, where again, we want to preserve this language, this is our way of speaking, and it's integral to our culture. And there are also, so cochlear implants are great, right? These are, if you don't know, these are, again, a way of improving the hearing for kids who have hearing loss, but they're not perfect, right? So you can actually listen to simulations of cochlear implants, and again, it's not always clear. We mentioned issues of ambiguity, so stuff like fricatives, so these are hissy sounds like s and sh in particular, so these are the first things to go in hearing loss, and cochlear implants actually don't do a great job of sort of dealing with that. So some deaf people who've had cochlear implants basically say like, I don't like this is bad, so I'm just gonna assign to my kid and not even bother with the implant. And you're right in that again, there are sort of arguments about the ethical nature of doing that. And I started talking in circles here, I apologize for that. Another thing to think about is that the earlier the better for language. And again, this counts for spoken language and sign language. So I think part of the issue with, again, just relying on, say, cochlear implants is that, again, it takes a while to get the surgery to get it in. It takes a while to calibrate it. And all the time, the kid is sort of losing precious time to learn a language. So there are a lot of advocates for, again, getting sign language into the home as early as possible. And sort of fears that if you just put the cochlear implant in, the parents will sort of say, well, we're good, and then not teach the child sign. So again, it is coming also from that perspective of we need to get sign into the house as early as possible because language is really important for just sort of general brain development. And yeah, there's a lot of infighting and sort of good arguments on both sides, I think, about that. I don't know if either of you have more familiarity.
Okay. All right. Question here in the middle.
This goes kind of circular here. You asked originally a question or somebody did, where did language come from? And my immediate reaction was the need to pass down traditions. And how do you do that? Well, there's showing and there's signing and there's grunts, et cetera, et cetera. And then this conversation got me around to, and you kind of brought it up a little bit, is the indigenous people in New England were so wiped out and so scared of saying that they were Native Americans that many of the children had no idea what was going on. And one thing I will say, I've had a connection through a friend of mine who's not Native but works very, very hard in doing bead work that's Wabanaki or Abenaki correctly done for it. And he has started to learn the language and has had to work with many different people to learn that just because it's important to him from the stories he's heard from the people he's known. And I just, when you're talking about the cochlear and having those problems of connections, I can't imagine being a child who couldn't speak to their mother because they weren't allowed to speak the language or say anything.
Yeah, I mean, our legacy in this country of, especially like the boarding school legacy and stuff with Native American children, and things that continue really to this day and through social services and removing Indigenous children from their homes and placing them with non-Native families, leaves really, really, really deep scars, generational scars. Being beaten for speaking your language, you hear now from the children or from the grandchildren that they still don't want to, or you'll see cases where, a grandchild will want to learn the language and their grandparent won't teach it to them because it was so traumatic and just so oppressed. And it is, talking about sort of, traditions or passing things down, I mean, obviously, on the one hand, as linguists, we're interested in the study of languages and, the really amazing and rich and varied ways that humans are able to express themselves and what that tells us about the mind and the brain. And so the languages themselves are interesting. But when you lose a language, especially because most languages are not written down, right? Writing is this other invention really on top of it. You lose a ton of indigenous knowledge and tradition along with it, which is the other big push for documentation, for recording stories with elders, and for compiling things in tools like Flex and Elan to make it understandable and to transcribe it and attach it to video. Because, I mean, it hurts to think about the volumes and volumes and volumes of information about the world that's been lost as languages have gone. I mean, we think about the burning of the libraries of Alexandria. I mean, every language that gets lost is kind of like that.
Okay, I got a question over there. Somebody who hasn't had one yet. No, I got one.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, what's the biggest change in spoken English at this point? Like, I remember years ago being told it was moving more to the positional language that we are than inflected endings. And I'm wondering if that's still the case. Or if it ever was.
So do you mean at recent change or over the past 1,000 years? Or?
Right now, what's going on
Our
right now
lifespan.
in America?
In our lifespan, I would say probably things like the California shift and within English. The vowels of English are radically different in different parts just of the United States, let alone other places. And so there's people from Philadelphia say bead instead of bag. People from Detroit say socks instead of socks, and so on. And this is a sort of thing that if it weren't checked by other sort of social circumstances that encourage people to pronounce things more comprehensively to each other, could eventually lead to diversification into separate languages. Now that doesn't seem likely to happen in current social circumstances in the US, barring some sort of collapse of our society like the fall of the Roman Empire. We have but the vowels seem to be unstable in English, so that my vowels, I don't have, well, one of the classic examples, we can say the words Merry Christmas and Mary had a little lamb and Mary got married, and so she felt merry. Those three words, Mary, 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 they're all pronounced the same to me, and I'm wondering here in this audience, how many of you think those are three different, they sound different? Mary, Mary, and marry. Most, it would seem, if you're in northern New England, I would think most people would have those different. So the vowels are radically different across different dialects, and then if you go to England, even more so. And there are differences in consonants also. So those seem like, I know that's one of the things that sociophoneticians look at a lot, is the vowels of English and how they are different in different places, social groups, etc. So maybe I should pass the microphone to sociophonetician.
Stuck again?
Yeah. I mean, exactly what you were saying. So they're even within northern New England. So again, Jim Stanford, his new book will describe all of this in great detail about what's been happening around here. I'm from around New York City, so I should have them different, but I don't. But the Mary, Mary, Mary difference is sort of going away in northern New England. So if you ask like a young person, right, unless they're from sort of far northern New Hampshire or sort of in Boston, would likely say that they're the same now. Same with, I'm always bad at doing it, so Haas and horse, so horse and horse, right? Again, the R thing is there too, but also sort of having a different vowel in those two words. Again, older people are more likely to have that different around here, young people more likely to have them the same. The vowel in start is also changing around here. So again, stat, if you don't have the R, but also start, you can also still have that really, it's a fronted ah sound. Again, younger people are more likely to have sort of a back start. So again, all sorts of things that are just rapid generational change in northern New England and sort of across the country. We're seeing these rapid changes happening.
Okay, let me actually I'm going to follow up if I can, because one of the things we've talked about frequently in the newspaper is you don't hear very often, and I talk to a lot of people in a lot of circumstances, I rarely hear what I think of as the traditional New Hampshire accent anymore.
It's very rare.
Usually from a guy with a big beard, right?
It's
and
very,
he's sitting in the back of town meeting, and he stands up and complains about taxes. So,
Why here to go to town meeting?
So, is it doomed?
So language always changes, right? And again, we sort of think like this is the traditional New England accent, but you know, we can sort of go back and look at old recordings and see sort of changes in the past, and then even looking before we had recordings, right? People don't talk the way that they did when this area got settled by the English, right? So yes, things are changing in northern New England, and we are losing some of the traditional features, like again, having Mary, Mary, Mary distinct, having horse and horse distinct, not having that R sound, and then like stot. But I think sort of the general socio-linguistic language change consensus is New England English will likely still be distinct from other parts of the countries in different ways. So one thing that's remained steady, that hasn't changed, that sort of people don't talk about it, but it's still there, is, so if you're from Minnesota, so the word C-O-T is,
Caught,
and then C-A-U-G-H-T.
caught, they're homophones.
Your homophones are?
No, I'm also from Minnesota.
They're all from.
Yeah, and
I
one's
thought
cat
they-
and one's caught.
There you go. So
Caught.
cat, caught, or from New York, caught and caught. Caught. But one feature of New England English is that Eastern New England English, so this is actually different if you're in Vermont or New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, they're the same, caught and caught, right? So that's one thing that hasn't changed, right? And it's partially because it's hard to split things apart once they're sort of together, but again, there will still be things that are distinct. Teaching undergrads, right, they're still saying wicked, right? So some other distinctive regional features will still likely hang on, even as, again, sort of the older features that make New Hampshire distinct disappear. Other ones will probably be emerging as it happens.
Okay. Question over here. Somebody who hasn't had one, you haven't had a question. You haven't had a question.
I would be interested in hearing your thoughts about what the current thinking is regarding the theory of universal grammar, the idea that human beings are born with certain grammatical concepts sort of baked into their brains. And I think of the work of Noam Chomsky and some of the early Steven Pinker stuff. So I'd love to hear what you think about that.
So my thoughts will be radically different from those of some other linguists. This is one of the most contentious and divisive issues among linguists. So you could even say among linguists much less than there was maybe 20, 30 years ago when it was a core issue, but there were, you could say there were Chomskyan and anti-Chomskyan linguists. And so that idea, Noam Chomsky, who's obviously famous also for his political writing, but professional linguist, and his big idea was that children are born having a template for the grammar of any language already, because children, as we know, they acquire language really quickly, much more easily than we can do as adults. Take any child and throw them down anywhere in the world, any monolingual English-speaking or Chinese-speaking or Maori-speaking environment, if we could find monolingual Maori-speaking environment, and that child would quickly develop fluency in that language in the course of a few years. Whereas all of us, throw us down there for 10 or 15 years and we're not going to be a fluent native speaker of the language. So there's something going on there. Chomsky's answer was that there is a universal grammar that all languages share, and that there's an innate, what he called a language acquisition device, not meaning an actual device, but something about the way that our brain is constructed that enables all normal humans to do that, to acquire languages easily and effortlessly, whereas, as he once put it, an otherwise intelligent chimpanzee can't. There's something, they don't have that part of the brain that enables you to do that, and that there was a universal grammar, that there's just certain things that all languages have in common structurally, and that the goal of linguistics then should be to figure out what that is. What is the universal grammar that all languages share? Because then you're not just finding out what languages are like, you're finding out what language is like. So that is the Chomskyan position, and it became, certainly for a long time, the mainstream position, but it always had its detractors also. I would be one of the detractors. Again, other people would strongly support that idea now, but my position, and I don't know if there's a majority position on this now, my position is that humans, that language has a lot of things that make sense if you look at it in terms of its communicative function or the way our vocal tract and our hearing are structured, things that are natural for a highly intelligent creature, and we're smarter than chimpanzees in a variety of ways. That a highly intelligent creature put in this environment where people like to communicate with each other, that you'll develop a spoken language based on what you hear around you without having this innate universal grammar, that what you have instead is sort of a common general level of intelligence, or if we don't like that term, a general cognitive ability for humans, and that same cognitive ability that allows us to do things like drive cars, which chimpanzees aren't good at, or various other things, is also what allows us to become good at language when we're exposed to the data. So I've tried to give you both views and those, I think, there really are still two camps now, but I think there are so many other things that
Is
linguists
there a
have gone
majority,
into.
one way or the other? No.
Is there a majority?
Chomsky and non-Chomsky?
Well,
I think,
strong positions, like there's a lot of.
yeah, I think what has happened is that it's not for all linguists the central issue that it was maybe 30 years ago, so that a lot of people say, well, I'm more interested in language documentation and less interested, or I'm more interested in the dialects of modern English in America, or I'm more interested in the history of the English language, or so on. And so you don't necessarily have to take a strong opinion on it. So, but we have a group of three here, so it's just, I don't know if my colleagues have their views on this issue.
I will say they're sort of our subsets of linguists who find sort of the current-ish, the most current strain of sort of UG, universal grammar, is minimalism, which is sort of like the latest 2.0 version. And I personally know linguists who sort of see that as a useful model to describe language and sort of to describe data without sort of ascribing any sort of cognitive reality to what that model shows us. So I know both the syntacticians, so the person who works on sentence structure, and the person who works on morphology, so the parts of words in my department sort of go, yeah, it's a useful model, but you know, I'm not willing to go strong Chomskyan and say like, this is how it works in the brain. So I think you do sort of see those sort of gray areas where people debate about the usefulness of the model and sort of how much they put into how much do I think this is sort of cognitively real and sort of reflective of how the brain processes language and how kids acquire language, and sort of how much is it just sort of a useful descriptive tool that can sort of get us somewhere without, again, necessarily making any claims about how the brain actually works.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. I think there's a lot of, I think one thing that's important to say, you know, because I've had people ask me, all right, so Chomsky, full of it, like, is he crazy or is he great? And, you know, regardless of how you want to answer that question, I think we have to recognize that our field of linguistics, the modern field of linguistics, would not be what it is today without Chomsky. Without his ideas, without all of the things that he has done over the years, without all of the bitter arguments that he has, you know, triggered over it. I mean, we would not be the modern field of linguistics without Chomsky's ideas. So, you know, love him or leave him, he's been hugely influential. And I think, I mean, for me personally, so I came from a rather Chomskyan department, I guess. I did my PhD at UCLA. So I'm more of a generativist than probably either of you two are, would that be fair to say? I'm also not a syntactician, and that's where most of Chomsky's main ideas these days are, is in sentence structure and not in sounds. He hasn't really worked on sounds since about 1967. You know, I think they're very, very useful tools, as Rachel said, and also I think there's something to the idea that humans are predisposed to language, you know, perhaps in addition to or above our other cognitive abilities. I mean, a lot of what happens in language you can see in other areas, you know, pattern recognition and things in the visual field versus auditorily. But, you know, I mean, there are areas of the brain that are correlated with language, and you know, so there's probably something to it, but what exactly that is, I don't think we know yet. I think those are sort of the next big discoveries waiting to be made.
Okay, thanks. And I remember reading years ago there was one of these people that taught chimpanzees to communicate, you know, using symbols, and they named one of their subjects Nim Chimsky, just to sort of stick it to Chomsky. So I have you, and then you.
I'd like to pick up on what was said about dropping somebody down in a culture and being able to absorb that language. And I remember, we're all familiar with the Navajo code talkers. And I had a college classmate who was of Hungarian extraction. And he used to repeat a story about the fact that Hungarians were used as spies in World War II because nobody who was not born speaking Hungarian could possibly speak Hungarian. it was something that the structure of the language or the grammar or the pronunciation, whatever it was, could never be learned by somebody who was not a Hungarian-born and native speaker. Aside to that, I understand that the same language family of Hungarians, I believe, Finnish, so they're really unique. But that was just a contribution. I'm interested in the accents. I'm speaking regular, but I got the beard, and I can talk New Hampshire just about as well as anybody in this room. And when I get on the phone and somebody asks, where are you from? I say Concord. They say, huh? And I say, oh, I'm sorry, you people pronounce it Concord. And when I say my first name, Stuart, people say George. So I've learned not to talk not to talk native. The problem is that I have, when I'm speaking into this little electronic device that's hidden in my pocket, and I want to dictate a memo or something like that, the damn thing don't understand me. And even if I try to drop into standard English, I will say a word and it will say, it doesn't say home, actually, it doesn't say nothing. It will type something that has absolutely no relevance at all. Now, is this because nobody can teach the software to recognize speech variations? Is it a problem with the so-called AI stuff? But where do we go from here? Where do we get to the point where we can speak and be understood?
Yeah, you sort of hit the nail on the head here, and you mentioned something sort of talking normal. So as a sociolinguist, we're sort of interested in I'm sort of interested in how people talk, and it often turns out that sort of our ideas about what counts as talking normal sort of goes into our ideas about what sort of people we think of as normal, which is sort of, it ends up being white people from the Midwest, right? So if you sort of picture like a newscaster, right, it's probably sort of, again, a white person from the Midwest. And again, we sort of have this conception of that's the normal way to speak. People from the Midwest don't have accents, even though there's a huge sound change. So like you mentioned, that there's a northern cities vowel shift happening in the Midwest where, again, you say sax instead of socks. So it's sort of contradictory to the facts on the ground to a certain extent. So what happens is that we have this idea about what counts as normal. So we have software engineers at places like Google or Amazon who, again, go in with this idea of this is normal speech, and they train their data. So a lot of how natural language processing works is you give the computer a big pile of data, you say, here's an ah, here's an a, here's an right? And the computer sort of learns, here's an ah, here's an a, here's an And the problem is if you train the computer on, say, an old white guy's speech from the Midwest, the computer's really good at recognizing an old white guy from the Midwest. But if you take a young African-American woman from the South, it's gonna go haywire. Or even, an old guy from New Hampshire, it's gonna have issues, right?
For certain definitions of old.
For certain. Yeah, and I think, and we see this problem in other areas of artificial intelligence as well, where visual systems might have issues recognizing African American people's faces, again, because the data has been trained on white faces. I think some companies are starting to realize they need to work on this, particularly, as I mentioned, World Englishes. There's a growing English market outside of the United States, and their English is even more different than ours. So if you want to sell cell phones with Siri in India, you better make sure that Siri can understand Indian English. I mean, I understand that Alexa is sort of working on regionally specific versions of Alexa that work with those different accents. But yeah, it sort of all comes down to sort of what do you think of as normal? And then when the software runs into something that's not quote unquote normal, it has problems.
Yeah, so I thought I'd add that to your question, will this ever get better? If there's money in it for the companies, right? I mean, that's, so they are aware of this now, but then they want want to sell things, and how big is the market of people with the real New Hampshire accent versus the market of people with the India accent. And so this also goes to what I said though about computational linguistics being a big growth field. If you are a company like Google, which has more money than it needs, then they can say, well, okay, we can work on this, we can hire linguists to work on this, as well as software engineers and everything else, to recognize that, yeah, we don't want to alienate too many customers, and we don't want to fall behind our competition who might be working on this. So I think long term, yeah, there will be improvement on that, but it certainly has a long way to go. I have, my first name is Tim, but when I lived in Houston, if I told people my name was Tim, not computers, but people, so same as Stuart and George, they would say, Ken? Ken. No, you got all three letters wrong. T-I-N, not K-E-N.
Okay, question. By the way, there's an awesome video online of a couple of Irishmen in a voice-controlled elevator, and you can't understand them. They're trapped, and being Irishmen, they get really foul mouthed. So. Do you have a question over here?
So my question is for Rachel, and I'm interested in learning modern Hebrew and biblical Hebrews, and I noticed that my kids learning Hebrew too, but they go to Sunday schools. So I don't know if it's wrong with me, or I think our pronunciation and interpretation of words are a little different. Do you think that Sunday school, learning through the Sunday school is kind of has some kind of influence learning languages, something like that?
Yeah, there are a couple of interesting things that sort of go on with sort of the tension between, so in the United States, many Jewish parents send their kids to Hebrew school or Sunday school either one day a week or 2 days a week, and the kids either learn some variety of the liturgical Hebrew that's used in services, or sometimes there's a push of, well, I want my kids to learn Hebrew as it's spoken in Israel because, you can go to Israel and have a conversation. And sort of the problem boils down to, well, there are differences between those two types of Hebrew, so which one are you going to prioritize? And there's the other issue of you can't learn a language with only 5 hours a week, or even that would be sort of maximal. You're spending all your time in Sunday school learning Hebrew. So I think there's often a desire, if I want my kids to go to Hebrew school and learn how to speak Hebrew fluently, it's just not going to happen because there's not enough time.
Because I'm learning through the University in Jerusalem, the Rosenberg Hebrew School, and it's totally different, I think.
Yep.
But there's the same issue with engineers from India living here who want their kids to learn Hindi, and they send them to school, 2 days a week, and of course, kids don't want to know. So. Question here.
Yes, with the voice recognition, so you're telling me I'm better off buying a car in New Hampshire because I'm from New Hampshire? Because the last car I had came from New York, and it doesn't recognize when I say a certain name, and it frustrates me. But Alexa that I brought up here does recognize almost every word I say. And I have one follow-up.
Unfortunately, I think wherever the headquarters are for your car is trained on probably the old guy from the Midwest in New York or New Hampshire. And yeah, Alexa's Google, right? Amazon. Oh, okay. Well, they also have more money than they know what to do with it. It's probably throwing a lot more money at the automatic speech recognition problem, so that might be why it does better. I'm not sure.
And I was told that I have a certain frequency that I can't. It was pretty bad, whatever it is, because of firing too many weapons. And so I began to wonder tonight, I know I'm missing some of the speech or some of the talk, especially in a room. So would that explain why I'm missing some of the voices that I'm hearing in some of the language and some of the words?
Do you know what the frequency is that you're missing?
He just said it was the same frequency as a weapon firing in my left ear.
Yeah, I mean, most of what you need for speech is sub 5,000 hertz-ish. And most of it is actually even a little bit lower than that. It's the things like the hissy sounds, like she was saying, the fricatives, that are distinguished by the higher frequencies. But for the most part, it's actually like lower frequency things. And so when your hearing starts going in the higher frequencies, that you're not losing too much speech information from that. You're losing some higher elements in speech, but the core bits of speech are still there. I mean, it's the same with phones, right? I mean, I can't remember the exact frequencies, but the phone actually only gives you a certain frequency band, and your brain recreates the rest of it. And I want to say that it's actually doesn't have a lot of the lower.
It's a bandpass filter, so
right.
It's low and high cutoff. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. So I think what's super interesting about the phone is that it actually has some of the lower frequencies that would give you pitch information cut out of it. Because the average person might have 100 to about 75 to 250 hertz is the pitch that most people are going to be speaking in. That actually isn't going through the phone. Instead, it's all of the spacing of the harmonics of that pitch. Your brain uses those to recreate the pitch, so you actually hear 200 hertz even though it's not coming through your phone line. So your brain's really, really good at recreating missing signal based on all of the math around it. So yeah, I'm not sure that it depends on where your frequencies are missing, I guess.
Go over there. Oh, no. Let's see, I think. All right.
Thank you. Are any of you fluently bilingual?
Like raised speaking two languages?
Well, can you speak another language pretty?
Yeah.
All right. So my question is a curious question. What language is that, may I ask?
French.
French. So if you and I were in Paris, and I'm a Frenchman, and I speak no English, it's French, and we're having a conversation, my question is, when you listen to me, do you translate that to English, and your response come back to me retranslated to French?
No.
Or do you think in French?
No, I think one of the things of like reaching a level of passable fluency is when you stop speaking in English, or stop thinking in English. Obviously, you want to stop speaking in English. That's the bare minimum. No, I mean that's really, and I was not raised speaking French, but I started studying when I was 5, and I've studied straight on through. And there was a point at which you suddenly realize, oh my gosh, I'm not translating this anymore. It's just coming in French, and I'm just processing it in French. And when the conversation was over, I'm still thinking about it in French. And I think that's like sort of the fluency level.
Thanks.
There were lots of hands. Somebody, you haven't asked a question yet, have you?
So with AI, I'm assuming some of your students are obviously getting on board because of speech recognition. And I'm thinking ADA compliance is all gonna come stick us all, right? So the phone not interpreting who we are and where we are, they're gonna have to be ADA compliant at some point, because help I've fallen, I can't get up has to be understood if you're in New Hampshire or California or Texas. So I was just curious, with all the linguists that you, skills that you have, and I imagine some of those students are probably going into crime or intelligence. Have you guys ever been called on to listen to something that maybe was a hybrid of languages that has evolved that someone couldn't nail down, and the FBI or CIA was trying to figure out, well, could this be these criminals and these criminals putting together a secret language? I was just curious.
Wow.
I've never been called as like an expert witness. I know that some linguists are, but the usual circumstance that I've seen, like, so for instance, with a lot of the recent like ICE raids or immigration court, I've seen a lot of calls for indigenous language interpreters, because a lot of Central American immigrants may not actually even speak Spanish. They may speak Zapotec, or they may speak Mayan, or they may speak Bribri, or they may speak some other language. And so there's been a lot of call in the court system for people who speak something other than just main languages. And I've seen calls in linguist circles for that. But Do you guys have thoughts about?
I will say first that the only accurate thing about the movie Arrival, I don't know if any of you saw that, is that linguists do frequently have helicopters landing on our backyards. Also, we all own houses that are much more expensive than the normal assistant professor could possibly own. Linguists do get called as expert witnesses sometimes in trials. I don't know of any linguists being called by the government. The Army has Army linguists, but by that they mean people who speak Pashto or Arabic or so on. The National Security Agency hires linguists, but we don't know what they do. I don't know because I don't work at the National Security Agency. It's more than top secret. And they hire mostly mathematicians for code breaking and so on. There was one well-known linguist who said his greatest achievement as a linguist was not the books he published or the students he taught, but there was a man on trial and there was a phone recording of him, and the prosecution was saying that this was a phone recording of this man, and the linguist was able to go in and demonstrate, no, it wasn't him because he has a Philadelphia accent, and the person on the phone has a New York accent, which sounds similar to outsiders, but he was able to demonstrate and find that, so this man, in fact, was innocent and was found not guilty, and he said that was his greatest achievement as a professional linguist.
I will say, I think there was, I'm blanking on what the name, it was like Jihad Bob or something. There was some ISIS fighter, and I know they work with some linguists to figure out he's not a native Arabic speaker, so where is he from? So I know there has been some work with that, with trying to figure out the native language with some ISIS fighters, and using that to sort of pinpoint where the person came from and who they sort of are. And I do know there's some bad government use of linguistics, so using Google Translate, which doesn't work very well, to look at people's social media to decide if they were a threat to the US. And that's actually led to some people sort of getting blocked from getting visas who probably shouldn't have gotten blocked. So yeah, sometimes it's not so good. Sometimes we do need trained linguists in there to say, no, don't use Google Translate, this won't work. But common sense.
Thank you. Let's see, what questions? How about you?
Well, that makes, talking about different languages, that makes me think, do any of your students go on to study linguistics as it relates to the non-human animal kingdom? Like with dolphins, you know, they all have a language, different animals have a language.
Yeah, ours do not do that at Dartmouth, although they may well at other places, simply because we have a fairly small faculty, and most linguists just sort of arbitrarily we define what we do as working on human language. And while other animals, dolphins, etc., have communication systems, they are not what human linguists normally work on. So people who do work on those things will typically be in the animal science department. And so if students come and ask us about those things, or about bee dancing, the way that bees communicate the location and distance of honey, we say, well, yeah, that's interesting to us, but our focus is simply on human language. So if any of our students have done that, I don't know of them. And it turns out that the students who end up majoring in linguistics find out the sort of things we're interested in, and that's what they're interested in. And if they're not, then they'll major in something else.
All right, questions here? I had a bunch of hands, now they're all gone, so I'll go back over here. Oh, you haven't asked yet.
I wanted to follow up on the earlier discussion about hearing loss and the impact of frequency band and all that sort of thing. I have initial stages of that, and being an engineer, of course, I had to investigate the whole thing. And talking with the audiologist, he said that the middle ear tends to put a resonance in the system right around 3 to 4 kilohertz. And that's also, as far as I can determine, where most of the PTK type stuff is encoded. So, and his follow-up comment was that that's where most hearing loss occurs because of that resonance. The high sounds damage the cochlear nucleus, and kind of go from there. So, And indeed, telephones, my father was in the phone business, also emphasizes that band, let's say 500 to about 3 kilohertz, because that's where all the information is encoded, and everything above that is just interesting but not needed. So I guess the comment would be, anybody in the linguistics field looking at ways you could sort of compensate for people like us who are starting to lose that critical decision-making area.
Yeah, so audiologists, so like Tim was saying, there's sort of a split between, people who work in animal communication and people who work on human language. There's also sort of a split of sort of both applied linguists who sort of work on taking sort of linguistic knowledge and using it for stuff like how to effectively teach people to teach English, how to help kids with learning disabilities. So audiologists, right, are sort of another sort of, I don't think you can really call them applied linguistics, but to a certain extent there is a certain amount of taking linguistic knowledge and using that to help people. So I would say that's sort of a problem that audiologists are working on that I don't really have any information about. I will say for p, t, and k, there is some redundancy in the system. So you can actually look at the resonance frequencies of the preceding or following vowel, and there is some information encoded about where that p, t, and k is being articulated. So there is some redundancy in the system there. Also some stuff with the duration of the vowel also can help sort of indicate, do you have a t or a duh? So there is some redundancy in the system, but you're right, if you start losing those higher frequencies, it gets more difficult.
Okay, I can just say that the thing I've lost that's causing the most trouble is differentiating suffixes. So I can get what the verb is in the context, but whether it ends in an S or an ED, I can't tell. And so I don't know whether my wife is talking about something that's going to happen or it did happen. And that makes all the difference in the world. And it's just pretty simple. Anyway.
As the world gets smaller, do you see that there's going to be hybrid language between some of the dominant languages, English, French, Spanish, or some other combination thereof?
I don't see that happening anytime soon, at least. What I see happening, what we all see happening, is fewer and fewer languages and more of the dominant languages that already exist expanding, so that English and Spanish and French and Chinese and Russian are not endangered languages, but that over the next, what are the figures that people have predicted for what percent? Over the next 100 years, percentage of languages, massive percent of languages will die off, but then you'll have over 1 billion speakers of Mandarin Chinese. And even within China, the different varieties of Chinese will be replaced by Mandarin Chinese, and you'll have hundreds of millions of speakers of English, and you'll have a fair number of people who are bilingual in those two, but not enough that you'll really get a hybrid, because for that you would need hundreds of millions of people who are bilingual in English and Chinese in order to create a hybrid of them. Otherwise, the number of bilingual people is so small compared to the vast number of people who don't speak both that their influence on the language will create a hybrid out of it.
Okay, I'll go here and I'll come back there.
Well, I used to teach Russian, and I speak Kazakh. So now when I was studying English, we taught to speak in correct academic perspective English. And when I read the article I think Rachel was arguing that there is no their descriptive English language is actually it's okay to say end the sentence with prepositions. And to me, as a ESL learner, it's challenging and I can't still agree with that, because I went through this whole process of learning, drilling correct English sentences, and now we're saying that, oh, that's okay. And I remember my ESL teacher saying that It's okay if you have an accent, I mean, I agree with that. It's okay if you do mistakes. It's most importantly that your communication has to be intelligible. So, and my question is, to me as a person who learned English, is incorrect way, and for me, I think it's a little listening American speaking descriptive. It makes me, I mean, I always try to fix it because I know I might not have a right to do that, but I usually do it because this is how I learned English 13 years ago. Now I teach ESL, I'm trying to, and my students, ESL students, are also trying to learn correct academic English, and they don't understand why can I say, like, where are you at? And I can't explain that why people say so, because I know it's wrong, but this article I read, I mean, it was like, I don't know, I can't wrap my mind around that. So my question is, so how do I have to define the mistake, you know, like what is incorrect late English, if there is something like that, if, you know, did you get my point?
Yes, yeah, I think, so this is actually something that linguists, descriptive linguists will mostly say that there's not in any absolute sense a right or wrong in language, but we have the same issue that you do in that we teach students to write, and if we have, as I did when I lived in Texas, students who wrote, 2 students in successive years wrote that Achilles drug Hector's body around behind his chariot. I have to, instead of dragged. I would have to meet with those students and tell them that I don't think that you're stupid because you wrote drug, because I know that's what people where you come from say for the past tense of drag. But you need to be aware that other people will judge you by your language. And there are socially established standards, and it's up to you to decide how you want to present yourself. And some people choose to present themselves one way, or in different circumstances to use different varieties of language. And it can certainly be helpful if you want other people to think of you as intelligent or educated, to speak in a certain way, or even more to write in a certain way. If you have a job application, you will probably want to pay attention to your spelling. Now, you might be brilliant, but the person reading your file looks at it and says, this person's an idiot, he can't spell, which may not be true, but you have to be aware of the reactions of people coming to you. And for non-native learners of languages in particular, as a non-native, you're aware that you're going to be judged based on the way that you speak, and there'll be often prejudice against you to begin with, so that if your English seems non-standard, then people can take that even more as a sign of, yeah, stupid foreigner can't even speak proper English. So that I can certainly understand how you and your students want to know what the socially established standard is. The difficulty is that there's not just one socially established standard. There are different people who have different views on it. It's sort of like clothing, right? So clothing is not, it is not absolutely correct that men should always wear hats. But 100 years ago, if you were a man in Western society and you went outside without wearing a hat, or a woman 70, 80 years ago and you weren't wearing a hat and gloves, well, that was wrong. Nowadays, I generally wear a shirt when I teach. And there are days in the summer when I, strictly speaking, wouldn't have to, but there's a social standard there which is very real, and I would be judged harshly and would even feel wrong myself if I were not wearing a shirt. On the other hand, if I'm at the beach and I'm planning to go swimming, I'm probably not wearing a sweater. So I think of language in that same way, and those social standards are very real. And for a language learner and a language teacher, you need to be aware of them, at least so that you can make the choices that you want to make about how you're going to present yourself linguistically, just like with clothing.
So if one of our, I mean, most of professors, my English professors, are, if they're using wrong, I mean, I call it descriptive, okay. Descriptive language, what do I have to think about them? What do they
So
I mean, it's, if you, I'm trying always watch what I say and how I say this, but if, you know, people with PhD, you know, teaching us and using incorrect descriptive language, ignore these rules, it's difficult for me to, you know, because
if I could add a thought to that, I think the other important thing that's sort of what Tim was saying to remember is that there's a huge difference between written and spoken language. And there are these, you know, standard acceptable things of how we write, and, you know, we spell things, we have agreed upon spellings, you know, this isn't Webster's day, you know, we've agreed that things are spelled a certain way. You know, there's certain standard punctuation, there's these rules that people have learned for forever that, you know, don't end a sentence with a preposition, which, I mean, to be honest, themselves are kind of ridiculous rules that were made up because Latin never ended things with a preposition, and therefore English should be Latin, and so we just made them up and then everybody stuck to them. I think it's fine. I mean, there's a time and a place for that kind of writing, and I think that you're doing the right thing by teaching students to write in a formal way when they're writing job letters or when they're writing whatever. You know, that's going to really help them. However, I also think in foreign language teaching, you know, as a student of studied many languages over the years, I also think that foreign language teaching can do a disservice to students by not teaching the student how language is actually spoken. Because you're going to have a really hard time understanding what anybody is saying to you if all you know is, you know, formal writing, because people don't speak that way. And so I think it's important to probably try and teach both. You know, here's how you would write this. You know, you're not going to write in a job letter like, I'm gonna come and do that. You know, I'm gonna do a really great job at your job. You know, but at the same time, people are gonna say that, and you need to understand it, and you need to be able to have friendships and, you know, speak to people in that way. And so, you know, there's a place for both.
Oh, here's one.
But it goes beyond.
Wait.
I've been teaching for 26 years in public school systems of New Hampshire. And what I'm running into, I'm a reading specialist, and I coach teachers. I'm running into more and more teachers who massacre our language every day as they try to teach our language. And I'm concerned that the modeling that's being provided to our kids by, you talk about your teachers with PhDs, and it's not just slang, but it's just correct grammar. You know, it's not me and Jack went hiking this weekend. I hear teachers speak this way all the time, and it's nails in a chalkboard. So yes, there's standard written English, and I'm only 50, mind you, I'm young, okay? It's not just standard written English. I mean, we need to provide this modeling, and we're not. Is that what you're getting at? It's very frustrating.
I'm a doctorate student too, and I'm trying to use, you know, I don't let.
I am a doctorate student too. I did education, so I'm trying to use correct English even when I talk to my kids too, because I think still language is a I mean, brings a tradition. You know, it's everything about the rule tradition. So I mean, and I agree with you. I think we should, if we teach, we should be able to, yes, that's true.
So I will say, so part of what this comes back around to is sort of what we think as sort of quote unquote correct or sort of quote unquote normal English. Again, as a sociolinguist, we sort of believe that a lot of that, again, sort of goes back to who do we think is normal, who do we think is correct. So a lot of the standards, so like Laura mentioned, a lot of these rules came about because it was sort of decided in the 1700s that Latin was the perfect language. Therefore, English should be like Latin. So like you said, we shouldn't end sentences with prepositions. And that the nominative case, so I should be, you know, it is I, right? We should have the nominative case in the second half of the sentence instead of, and again, that was a rule from Latin. If we actually look at the structure of English as descriptive linguists, who sort of linguists is sort of just describing how language is out there, we see that the accusative case, me, is sort of inherently kind of the default case in English. So who's there? Me, right? That's sort of what people actually do. part of that goes down to is there's sort of a lot of baked in assumptions, again, about sort of who is normal and who is correct. And again, it also tends to be sort of slightly upper class, again, usually white people, people from the Midwest who are sort of, again, seen as sort of quote unquote normal, so the way they talk is normal and correct, and people who sort of deviate from that in some way, from being from another part of the country, being lower class, being of a different race, right? Then you start getting into, well, they don't speak English correctly. And again, if you look at stuff like African American language, African American English, right? Again, that's seen as incorrect or broken English, but it's actually has its own very complex rules. So one example, he be running, right? You can sort of look at that and say, well, that be is it's just incorrect. It should be he is running. But actually that be means something different. It means like he habitually runs, so he often runs, he's a runner. So again, sort of from a prescriptive point of view, that's quote unquote incorrect. But as a descriptive linguist, we would sort of look at that and say, oh, this is actually an entirely different system. So going back, yes, there are certain standards, and it is good to teach children that, again, people are going to judge you for the way that you talk, so it might be beneficial to sort of learn how to code switch. So use different varieties of languages in different situations, just like you change your clothes to go to the beach or teach a class or go to church or go to synagogue, you wear something different. Use different language in different points of view in different situations. So, I don't know if
Okay.
yeah.
We're getting near the end. Do you want to
No,
follow?
it's fine.
We're getting near the end. A question over here from somebody who hasn't asked one yet.
So I've been wondering this for a long time, and it kind of follows on with what's just now been being said. You talked about years ago men didn't go out without a hat, and women wore a hat and gloves. And we've relaxed a lot of those rules. And when I even read a lot of written English, that's what I'm reading, right? Written. I see sentence structures that are just wrong, or they'll use the word that to refer to a person instead of who, and I'm wondering if you see that English is actually somehow becoming a little more relaxed in terms of how people are effectively using it, or maybe just sloppy, but certainly not so precise as maybe it once was. I don't know.
So I think, again, this comes down to a difference between written and spoken English. By virtue of the fact that, everything we can hear from the 18th century or the 19th century is only written words. We didn't have recordings of people speaking. It was a formal style. It was following these rigid rules of Latin, not splitting infinitives because it's only one word in Latin, things like that. And people adhered to that. There was very, very formal writing for a long time. I do think you see a relaxation in a writing style these days. People are feeling more comfortable in writing in what sounds like more of a vernacular. This certainly is the case in academic writing as well. If I read a paper from the 40s, it is a slog. Because it's so unnatural, right? And frankly, I would much rather read a paper that's written in a way that's a little bit closer to speech. I don't want to have emojis in it necessarily, but something that's a little bit more like I would actually speak it. I don't think that this means that the language has necessarily changed and gotten more relaxed, though, because I bet if we were able to go back to the 18th century, you would find people using that to refer to a person just as much then as you do now. They just didn't write it down, because the people who were writing at the time tended to be high class, very educated. There was much more of a bar of entry to who could write things, who could publish things. And we're living in a day and age where anybody can write things and publish them, and so you're getting more diversity in what's ending up in the printed word, but I think the spoken word has always been very, very diverse.
Yeah, I'd actually add that I don't think there's a relaxation, just different sorts of standards are being established, and there's more freedom to use different styles in more printed material, but in other written material that people have been jotting down notes for a long time, or at periods like during the Middle English period, there's tremendous grammatical diversity in ways that we would simply not accept today, just sound bizarre to us. But there were things, so there's change over time in what the grammatical structures are that are accepted or not accepted. So for example, we no longer, for a direct object pronoun, use hin, we use him instead. But there used to be a distinction between I saw hin and I gave him the book. Now we just say him for both of them. I saw him, I gave him the book. And so the grammar has changed. Some things are looser maybe, but others are stricter. And if you look at certain writing styles, I think the writing style for writing, say, legal documents, such as property when you're buying or selling, that is far more complicated than it used to be. And there's a formal system for that. And so it depends, and yeah, the definitions of terms have gotten much stricter for certain styles of writing for certain topics. So I don't think even for written language that we're seeing any loosening. It's just that we're seeing more different varieties of written English in print nowadays, or not even in print, online, because even with printing you have sort of gatekeepers and it costs money to print stuff. But if you're online, then anyone can write anything, and so it is sort of the way that people talk, which again is sort of the way that it was in the Middle English period, when English was just something people spoke and maybe wrote down, but French and Latin were the languages that you wrote in if you wanted to be educated, so that there's tremendous variation there in spelling in particular. Spelling in that period is chaotic.
All right, we have time for one short question. It's got to be quick because we've got to let the panelists go. You got a short question?
I have a short
She has a short question. All right.
This is for Rachel. Now I know Yiddish has lost a lot of speakers. I grew up in an entirely speaking Yiddish family. But what other languages, other than, I know there's a Sephardic language from the Iberian Peninsula, which name escapes me, what other languages like Yiddish and that one have been lost also?
I will say there are a lot. So on Yiddish, Yiddish is still surviving among the ultra-Orthodox, right? So there are certain communities where Yiddish is being passed down. Basically throughout Europe and the Middle East, if you had a local Jewish community, there was a local indigenized variety. So Ladino, for sort of a Jewish version of Spanish, Yevonic was sort of the Greek version. There was a Judeo-Italian. There are Jewish languages of the Caucasus, which again, a lot of these we only either have one or two speakers left, or it's going away. So Ross Perlman has done some of this documentation in New York City, again, looking for those languages that are disappearing.
Cool. I didn't give you a chance to talk about Mel Brooks, so anyway. All right. Okay, I think we are about finished. Thank you. Very much appreciate them giving us their time and expertise. And as I said, the next one is going to be the 20th, the third Wednesday. We'll be talking about engineered lumber. ScienceCafeNH.org is our website. If you need to find out more, you can and send us an email if you get on the mailing list, so I can alert you to what it's coming. And thank you very much. Thank you.